Oh damn, I've got to get out of here, Damon thought. He knew there were some risks operating in this city. The police did not like drug dealers, and the mayor had declared a war on drugs. But the money was so good, and it had worked well for so long. I almost had enough to move home, Damon thought. He thought working out of this high-end neighborhood would keep him safe. And it had, for a while. Damon saw the action from the upstairs window. Down the street, it looked like they were assembling. Damon had a choice: get the drugs or get the money. He grabbed the beat-up stuffed backpack out of the hidden spot in the basement. Damon then slipped out the back door into the backyard. Damon saw the reflection of the police flashlight on the sides of the neighbor's house. They were close. He took a moment, looked around, and soon was climbing over the back fence into the neighbor's yard. They're going to catch me, he thought. I need to stash this money somewhere, quick. Damon was in the backyard of the house, directly behind the rental house he had been living in. Frantically, he looked around. He noticed a foundation vent. He thought that could work. Quickly, Damon was on his hands and knees. He swung open the vent window. He squeezed through the vent opening and was now in the crawl space under the neighbor's house. It was filthy, and God knew what was living under this house. He didn't care. He needed to stash this money. This was his future. Damon crawled deep under the house, pushing through spider webs and other filth. He found a small depression in the ground. He tucked the red backpack into the depression and slid a loose piece of lumber over it. Now I've got to get out here, he thought. He emerged filthy from the debris under the house. So far, no cops, he thought. Damon walked straight through the side yard toward the front of the house, brushing the dirt off his clothing as he walked. He took a moment and studied the house. He memorized the address, 5718. He repeated the address over and over, committing it to memory. He turned right, heading down the sidewalk, one street over from his street, where the cops were. If I can make it to the corner, Damon thought, I can cross into the parking lot and quickly slip into the park. At that point, I should be free, he thought. With a flicker of optimism, Damon walked briskly toward the corner. The route seemed to be clear, and he started to jog casually across the street toward the church parking lot. That's when the first two police cars showed up. Damon's reaction was to try to escape. He turned, took 2 steps in the opposite direction. That's when the third cop car appeared, blocking his path. Hands behind his head, he stopped and was quickly surrounded. I wondered how my life had gotten to the point I was at now. It didn't seem that long ago that all seemed wonderful. Things were going well. I used to be happy most of the time, I thought. On the other hand, I can't really complain. I have this great house in Ballard. True, I've had to make some changes. I no longer have the trendy office space I once had. But I do have a nice home office and a decent contract job in the tech industry. And I have Mel. I think. She's beautiful and successful. Just then my phone rang. I saw from the screen it was my cousin Mike. Yo, JD, what is up? Mike greeted me. Just wrapping up. I told him. Mel working? He asked. I guess so. She's not home. I told him. I never knew when she was working or not. With her job, she could be gone a lot. Even more so lately, it seemed like. Mike suggested we meet at the Norseman, a neighborhood bar partway between Ballard and downtown Seattle, where Mike's office is. Mike is an assistant district attorney working out of the King County Prosecutor's office. He often had interesting stories of criminal activities. My mother and his father are twins. Our families were close growing up, and we were just a year apart in age. Mike and I stayed friends, and I would have to say he is one of my closest friends. He was already at the Norseman by the time I got there. He had ordered me a porter, my normal beer of choice. He looked like he'd had a long day. Suit jacket off, white shirt wrinkled, tie loose. Thanks, cuz, I said, and we silently toasted clinking glasses. We sat there for a moment in contented silence, just enjoying the solid bond of family and many years together. We are very different. Mike's kind of an alpha, and me more of an introverted nerd. In reality, I really wasn't that bad. That's just how I thought of myself. How are the criminals treating our fair city these days? I asked Mike. He just shook his head. During the protests and rioting in the city, the liberal downtown government had slashed funding for the police department. It was as if the mayor had rented a billboard with a sign saying, "Criminals welcome," and "Don't worry, if you are caught, you won't be punished." The only thing there seems to be a firm stance against was drugs. Drug trafficking was looked at quite seriously. There was something a little odd that happened not far from your place. Some guy was selling drugs out of a house real close to you and Mel. Where was that? I asked him. I don't know, but I'll find out. It's possible I may even get the case. The odd part about the deal is that usually these drug houses aren't in a nice neighborhood like Ballard. Your house has to be worth $1 million, if not more. Mike told me. Normally we see this happening in the bad parts of Renton or Tacoma, not in your type of neighborhood. Mike said. He was right. Our home value along with the entire neighborhood had gone way up. Amazon, Microsoft, and other tech employment had increased demand dramatically. The house I had purchased not that long ago for around $500,000 was easily now worth more than $1 million. I thought. I wonder which house it was. Not sure, Mike said. But if it's like any of these other drug houses, look for the one that's run down looking, probably an overgrown yard. That's probably it. Mike went on. I thought for a moment. Most of the neighbors worked hard to keep their houses and yards nice, or hired people to do it for them. I did recall one house around the block that was in much worse condition than the rest of the neighborhood. That was pretty close to us. Was that the drug house? I couldn't remember seeing any activity that looked like drug dealing in the area. We got to talking about other things, and I soon forgot about the drug house around the corner. When I got home, Mel was there. I wondered what kind of mood she'd be in. Mel worked for a large advertising firm in downtown Seattle. She looked up as I walked in, nothing resembling a smile on her face. Oh, another bad mood. How did it get so bad so quickly, I asked myself. Hey, how was your day? I asked. For the moment, her response was silence. She was studying something on her phone. Mel, I said. All of a sudden, she looked up at me. A better description was she glared up at me. Definite negativity in the look. I quickly began going through a mental checklist of anything I may have done wrong. About 3/4 of the way through the list, Melanie replied. How was my day? She stated, aggression in her voice. Well, JD, the heavy emphasis on my name. I'll tell you about my day. First off, there are rumors of a reorg at the office. We've got a new executive director from the New York office. Word is he's a real numbers guy. I am now assistant producer on 2 of the least profitable clients. So my day was fairly screwed up. She told me. And somehow the way she put it, it felt like her misfortune was my fault. Honey, I said and moved to comfort her. I'm sure it's not that bad. You do a great job. They're lucky to have you. You don't have anything to worry? Moving toward Mel to give her a hug and comfort her, she held both hands up, palms out in an unmistakable stop gesture. I did stop. Now she was back to her phone, pecking and scrolling at who knew what. I retreated to my office. My thoughts picked up on the subject I had contemplated earlier. How did I get to the situation I now found myself in? A little less than 5 years ago, my life was very different. I was living in a studio apartment in Bellevue. I was a programmer for Microtech. I was single and making good money, I thought. On the side, I was developing a financial software program that I had worked on, off and on, since college. I was a contract employee at Microtech, so what I created on my own, I owned. The program was designed to help with home budgeting automatically. I thought there was a chance it would have mass appeal. It became sort of my hobby, and I would work on it during my off time for Microtech. I happened to meet a guy who worked at one of the big banks. He became interested in what I was doing and put me in touch with their IT department. They introduced me to one of their software providers. We ran some tests, and I made some improvements. So far, everyone liked my program. I had a friend at Microtech, Isaac Young. Isaac and I would share different ideas about the tech business. We seemed to agree on a lot of things. The idea of going into business together was something we discussed. We both had a lot of ideas. And then I got the offer. One of the big tech companies wanted to buy my program. The offer was in the high 6 figures. I had to sign away all the intellectual property on my program, but it was worth it. Now suddenly my life was very different. I had money and I had options. My dad, before he died, always urged me to buy real estate. Things in the Puget Sound market were expensive, but I never forgot that advice from my dad. I ended up buying a nice single-family home in the Ballard neighborhood. It needed some work, but I had a bit of carpentry skills and I saw fixing up the old place as a challenge. I bought it for cash, and I still had a chunk of money left over from the software sale. As I said, I had options. One of the options was to go into business for myself. Immediately, I thought of Isaac. He and I had a number of different ideas. Isaac and I met and talked about business. Since I had the cash, I would fund the business. I would own 75% and Isaac would own 25%. We agreed that if we were going to be a real business, we would have to look like a real business. That meant an office and furnishings so people knew we were serious, not two nerds playing on computers in the garage. We got a deal on a small office in a trendy tech section of downtown Seattle. It was a neighborhood of other offices, art galleries, chic restaurants, and popular bars. Life was very exciting for me. I began to notice many of the other people in the area around our office. They were younger, attractive, successful-looking, and well-dressed. One night after work, Isaac and I decided to get a drink at one of the upscale bars near the office. I observed all the stylishly dressed, attractive people around my age in the bar, and then I took inventory of my own appearance. Black sweatpants and a navy blue hoodie. Under the hoodie was a lime green t-shirt from some old teenage rock concert I attended. My hair was unstylishly long and I needed a shower. The idea of approaching a woman looking the way I did was absurd. I vowed to myself I would change my image. I began dressing better. I bought new clothes. I had my hair cut in a more normal style. I didn't shave every day, but I never let my beard get scraggly. One day before heading off to the office, I took a look at myself in the mirror. I was lanky, 6 feet 2 inches, probably 150 pounds. My long but styled brown hair had light highlights suggested by the stylist. I was dressed in nice jeans and a button-down shirt. Not too dressy, but I didn't look like the slob I once did. I felt good. I looked better than normal. We were having some early success with the business that was producing some revenue. I had money in the bank and a nice house in Ballard, and property values were rising. One day at work, this hip chick with a nose ring popped into our office and handed me a flyer. "Hey," she said with a big smile on her face. "There's a gallery opening tonight on 2nd near Pike. The address is on the paper. You guys should come," she told us. We set the flyer aside and continued working. Later that day, I noticed groups of young, successful-looking people out in the neighborhood, active, going places, and looking like they were having fun. I picked up the flyer the girl had left. I glanced at the activity outside. "Isaac, we should go to this gallery thing tonight," I said. He looked at me with a blank, puzzled expression on his face. "Do what?" Isaac asked. "Let's go check out this gallery," I replied, picking up the flyer and waving it. "Excuse me?" Still confused, he replied. "Isaac, we work 12 hours a day or more. We've made a little money. Let's go have some fun. Who knows, maybe we'll meet some women," I added. "Sure," he said. "I'm in," he replied. Then he took another look at the flyer, studying it for a moment. "A gallery?" He shook his head with a half smile on his face. Several hours later, we found ourselves in a busy, large room. Walls painted an eggshell white with works of art displayed on the walls and stands throughout the rooms with various sculptures. There was a tall Asian woman circulating with flutes of champagne. Isaac and I were each offered and accepted the champagne. Then, we really didn't know what to do, so we wandered around a bit aimlessly. Neither of us knew a thing about art. At one point, I was alone looking at a particular painting when I sensed someone behind me. "She really is good, isn't she?" a female voice said from slightly behind me. Without replying, I turned and saw this striking young woman looking at the painting in front of me. Dark, nearly black hair, an oval face, slightly olive-complected, a pronounced nose that for me was interesting looking, and a tight-shaped body. She gave me an odd look. I guess I had stared at her too long, and I still hadn't said a word. She hesitated, still looking at me oddly. "Do you like the Munt?" she asked. After a moment, I realized that the artist must be named Munt. I redirected my gaze at the piece of art. "Yes," I replied, and then I said, "To be honest, I don't know a thing about art. My partner and I got a flyer and decided to come." "Partner?" she questioned with a slightly raised eyebrow. In this day and age, the term partner has several connotations. This dark-haired beauty was staring at me, most certainly wondering what side I played for. "Yes, my business partner, Isaac," and I nodded across the room where Isaac was looking at some type of metal sculpture. "Oh," she replied with renewed energy. "You're in business?" she asked. "Yes," I said and offered her my hand. John David Wisniewski. JD. I introduced myself, and we shook hands. JD, she said, staring at me and still holding my hand. Nice to meet you. I am Melanie. Now, she said, I want to see what's in this room. With that, she grabbed my arm and steered me toward a piece of art in the adjacent room. Suddenly, we were having this nice, get-to-know-you conversation about our lives. She said her name was Melanie Miller, and she worked at a large advertising agency with an office in downtown Seattle. She told me what she did and where she lived. Occasionally, she asked me something about my life, but it was mostly Melanie talking about Melanie. And at the moment, I was fine with that. As if watching myself from a hidden camera, I had this image of the scene, strolling a trendy upscale art gallery arm in arm with this gorgeous, striking woman, well-dressed and successful. I couldn't believe it was me in the scene. Just a short time ago, my mental image of myself was far different. Nerdy, slightly introverted, no sense of style, very different than what my image at this moment would look like to others. I felt I was playing a role of being a young, successful, casually well-dressed entrepreneur. A couple of times I noticed Isaac noticing me. The look on his face was as if he could not believe what he was seeing. He knew me as the nerdy me. As the evening wound down, I knew I wanted there to be a next chapter in this, I guess, friendship with Melanie. But I did not know or have the experience to ask for the next date. As it turned out, I need not have worried. Melanie took charge. After a brief hug, but not so brief that I didn't get a hint of her curves, she told me she would meet me at Infusion, a super trendy bar not too far from my office, Friday night at 7 p.m. Okay, I replied. It felt like I had no choice but to agree. I watched as she walked away down the rainy streets of downtown Seattle with 3 other women. I felt like my life had just ever so subtly changed. Mostly I was excited about the change, but there was a small part of me that was worried. What was all that about? Isaac asked me. I paused for a moment, still staring at Melanie and her friends. Isaac, I said, I have no idea. As we headed back to the office, I told Isaac that we were going to Infusion Friday night. That Friday at the bar was fun too, at first. An extension of the art gallery evening. Melanie and a group of her friends showed up, late, but they showed up. I was with Isaac. Isaac made an effort to blend in, dressed well, and was talkative. We were actually at a corner of the bar, and it was a busy scene. Again, I felt like I was playing a role, the young, successful entrepreneur. For a moment, I worried. What if Melanie finds out that's not who I really am? And then I thought to myself, but I am a young, successful entrepreneur. My confidence blossomed. But there was still an undercurrent of insecurity. We had a good time. We talked about our work, current events, our lives, and mostly Melanie talked about Melanie. I didn't care, I just enjoyed being with her. As the evening progressed, our group evolved to me and Melanie talking, and Isaac with Melanie's friends. I had my arm loosely around her waist. Our heads close and our conversation became quieter, more intimate. I felt this was going in a very good direction. As I stared at Melanie, I watched her eyes change from half-lidded LY, focused on me, to suddenly wide open and gazing over my right shoulder. Harrison, she exclaimed. And as she said this, she shrugged my arm away from her waist and moved toward whoever she was focused on behind me. I turned to see Melanie hug this guy, big, taller than me, and a little older than me. And I knew his type. He was the class president, starting quarterback, the big man on campus. Tall, handsome, and confident. The kind of guy that had intimidated me all through school, without even knowing it. My thin mantle of confidence quickly cracked. It was probably a good 2 minutes into their conversation before Melanie introduced me to Harrison. Harrison Locke, he said, and shook my hand. All I said was hi. Eventually I told him my name, and we all talked for a few minutes. And then there was an awkward silence, no one knowing what else to say. Well, Harrison finally did say, I don't mean to interrupt your evening, and made motions as if he was going to leave. No, Melanie clutched his arm. Kind of like she did to me at the art gallery when we first met. I really should go, Harrison said. I'm with some people. And he nodded to a group across the room, all well-dressed, handsome, and successful looking. With a hug to Melanie and a hand clapped on my bony shoulder, he left our area. Harrison works at McClatchy Reed with me. Melanie elaborated. He's our client manager. I've been trying to get on the client side of the business for the last year. It's a tough job, but that's where the money is. She told me. All the time she was talking to me, she was staring off, over my shoulder in the direction of Harrison Lock. The intimacy we had shared just 10 minutes ago was gone. I now felt insecure and out of place. It wasn't long before Melanie and her gang declared it was time to go. "Call me," Melanie said to me. "Let's do something together soon." And with the briefest of hugs and a light kiss on my cheek, she was gone. Isaac and I left almost immediately after. On the way home, I analyzed my feelings. Throughout all of high school and parts of college, I had longed for girls like Melanie. It was almost like reading an Archie comic and seeing Betty and Veronica, shapely, beautiful, and full-breasted. That was the kind of woman I wanted. My girlfriends have been far more plain. If a particular girlfriend I had was attractive facially, normally her body would not be great. The selection of girls I was to choose from was most certainly a notch or so below the Melanies of the world. I know that all sounds terribly superficial, but it was how I felt. I couldn't help it. This was why the evening ended so disappointingly for me. I felt I was closer than I had ever been to the kind of girl I had always wanted, but Harrison's presence firmly reminded me of the kind of guy that someone like Melanie would end up with. With resignation, I realized I would never call Melanie. I didn't need to put myself through all the likely rejection. It was nearly a week later, and I had emerged from my post-Melanie funk, and life was back to normal. Any mood change I had experienced was left unsaid between Isaac and I. Out of the blue, my iPhone vibrates. "Hey stranger, it's Melanie. I thought I might hear from you by now," she says. I was so stunned by the phone call I said nothing at first. In my mind, my brief encounters with Melanie were solidly in the rearview mirror. Hadn't she moved on? I finally choked out. "I've been busy at work," I uttered, the feeblest of excuses. "Well, you can't work all the time," she told me. "Let's go do something tomorrow night. I'll text you my address," she added. And just like that, the emotional buoyancy of the art gallery night had reinflated. I was confused but excited. Maybe I could end up with a good-looking woman like Melanie? That Friday night was a good night. We went to a nice sushi restaurant in the Pioneer District. After that, we went to Bilateral, a very hip, semi-gay club, and danced until late. One thing I have to mention, when I was growing up, every summer I would camp for a week with Mike, my cousin's family. Mike's sister would bring her friend, Gabriella. Gabriella taught us to dance. And though socially I could be awkward and athletically I was a bit uncoordinated, I could dance, and I was pretty good. I think my dancing skills surprised Melanie. She seemed pleased with the way I danced. I felt I had passed some type of acceptance test. Much later, we ended back at her place. No roommates were visible. We ended up on her couch. We started kissing, and I could tell she was into it. After a while, I started kissing the side of her neck, and she began to massage my back sensuously. I slipped one hand down to her beautiful jug. "No," she softly breathed into my ear. I could feel her swollen dugs through her clothes. I was turned on, she was turned on, but no means no, and I removed my hand. "You're not stealing second base tonight," she told me. "No," I asked. "Not tonight, big boy," she said. "But this time you better call me. And soon," she told me. She walked me to the door, and this led to another briefer but intense makeout session. I was holding her full frontal to full frontal. I could feel her jugs, and there was no way she didn't feel my erection. "Good night, big boy," she said with a half smile, and when she said, "big boy," she glanced down to my groin. And with that, she gently pushed me out and softly shut the door. And there I stood in the hallway of her apartment complex with a stupid grin on my face and a giant erection. What a night. I did call her, and we started seeing each other at least a couple of times a week. I would have liked to be with her more than this, but I didn't want to act desperate. It must have been about our fourth official date, and I had invited her to my house where I had planned to cook her dinner. She hadn't been to my house before. The house was old, but in a nice neighborhood of older, mostly well-preserved homes. Values were skyrocketing. My house was solid, but needed some updates. For example, there was a rotten old cedar patio off the dining room accessed by a clunky-looking aluminum sliding glass door. This was on the list to replace. Melanie seemed interested in the house and slowly strolled about, examining small details like the built-in bookshelves and the old tiled fireplace. It was almost like an appraisal. I had seared ahi and added rice and vegetables. Delicious and healthy. After dinner, Melanie sat in the living room with a glass of wine. I cleared the table and dashed upstairs for a minute, did a few things, and returned to the living room. "Do you want to see the upstairs too?" I asked, my face a mask of innocence. "Here we go," she joked. "I remember that line from my first fraternity party at college," she said, but with a friendly smile. After that first night at her apartment, we'd had a couple more make-out and fondling sessions. We still hadn't made love, but we were getting close. We walked up the stairs hand in hand. I showed her the guest bedroom and then my room. Once again, she looked at small details, opened closet doors, and examined the books on my nightstand, nodding as if in approval as she saw my house. Lastly, I showed her the upstairs bathroom. While she had been sitting in the living room, I had drawn a bubble bath and placed small votive candles throughout the tiled bathroom. The candle and bath oils combined to make a pleasant, sensuous scent in the small room. "What?" she replied in surprise. "This is wonderful. But who is this for?" Slightly confused, she asked. "Well, it's for you. Us," I said, and with that I started removing my clothes. "Are you just trying to get me naked?" she asked, half joking. "Not necessarily," I said, "but normally you disrobe before taking a bath," I told her. By that time I was down to my underwear, and when I removed that, now I was nude. Nude with the same giant erection I had that night at her apartment. She stared at my meat. I watched her. She stared for a solid 10 seconds. She then stared right into my eyes and stripped, her gaze never leaving mine. I remember many teenage fantasies about beautiful women with beautiful bodies, naked. And though I'd had my share of sexual adventures so far, nothing compared to Melanie, naked. The beautiful dark hair, the striking face, the slim waist, and beautiful jugs. I moved to hug her, to touch her, and she held up both palms in a stop gesture. "I thought we were taking a bath?" She smiled and told me. It was a clawfoot, and there was room for both of us. Sort of. I sat behind her, my legs spread, and she was nestled between them. I poured warm water over her hair and gently washed it, massaging her scalp. She was slumped back against me, enjoying the sensuous experience. I was reasonably comfortable except for my full erection. There didn't appear to be any place comfortable to put it. I hoped there would be later. After I did her hair, my hands moved down to her neck and shoulders. We both knew what was next, and her dugs were already swollen by the time my hands got to her jugs. I squeezed, massaged, rubbed, and fondled her beautiful jugs. I had an involuntary urge to suck her dugs, and I even moved my neck that direction. But in this position, no one is that flexible. Finally, I began to rub her most sensitive area. For a few minutes, we just lay in the tub, the tiny candles reflecting onto the ceiling, the warm water finally still, the only sound, Melanie's breathing and soft moaning. She tilted her head, turned, and kissed my jawline. "We better do something with that thing before it explodes," Melanie half whispered to me. I laughed at the mental image as I dried her off. We make it to my bed. I'm afraid sex may not last too long, and I want to prolong this first experience, though it was good. We lay blissfully for a while, content physically. To me, this was something special. I hoped it was for Melanie too. I wanted to talk to her about my feelings and my commitment to her, but I waited. I didn't want to get too serious and ruin the moment. After a few minutes, she slid off the bed and headed for the bathroom. I lay there content, wondering and hoping that this feeling would last for a long time. This began a new, more intimate chapter for our relationship. The fact that she accepted and wanted me sexually made me feel good. My own self-confidence grew, and that was positive and healthy for our relationship. Even though we had not had a discussion about any declaration of exclusivity, we were exclusive. I know I was exclusive, and I mostly trusted Melanie. One night, we were meeting some work friends of hers for a drink. She introduced me to them as her boyfriend. It was a small thing, but it was a statement of our advanced dating status that I was happy to hear. Later that night, in my house in bed, we talked. "So I'm your boyfriend now?" More a statement than a question. She hesitated before answering. "Of course you are," she said. "We're screwing." And with that statement, I reconfirmed my status to Melanie's great pleasure. These were good days for me. Isaac and I were doing fairly well. No huge deals yet, but we did have an income stream to some degree. In the tech world, you cannot relax. New technology is changing so fast you cannot afford to take your eye off the ball. And then of course my relationship with Melanie made me so happy. It wasn't perfect, there was not great balance. We mostly did what Melanie wanted. She was in charge. For the most part, one was the dependent variable. Still, I was not complaining. I had the beautiful girl I always had wanted, and now apparently she wanted me too. I recalled when Isaac and I had first moved into our office space, and I used to watch the people out on the street. Mostly young, successful-looking people, going places in groups looking like they were having a good time. I was now one of them. I imagined someone watching me walking arm in arm with beautiful Melanie and being envious of me in my life. It made me feel good. I now felt like I was part of the in crowd. But there were insecure moments when I wondered if this was all just a temporary situation. Would it all end and I revert to the nerddom of my previous life? I tried to shove those thoughts to some back corner of my brain. One night, Melanie and I met up with my cousin Mike Fairchild, the assistant district attorney. Mike and I had been close our whole lives, and Mike had protected me more than once when some a-hole tried to bully me. We met at a less trendy place called the Dandelion Pub. Nothing wrong with it, but it was far from the upscale places Melanie was used to near my office. Though there was no specific problem between Melanie and Mike, it was a slightly uncomfortable evening. As I have said, Melanie likes to be in control, and truly this doesn't bother me. Every relationship has its own dynamics, and that was the way ours was. But Mike, ever my protector, kept trying to inject me into whatever particular conversation, trying to balance my interests with Melanie's. The entire evening ended a little sooner than planned, to everyone's relief. A few days later, Mike and I met for lunch. "What did you think of Melanie?" I asked him. He paused and answered, "She is definitely different than some of your other girlfriends." He told me, "Yes, isn't she?" I replied, "She is so cool and fun to be with. I'd do almost anything for her." I told Mike. He sat for a minute, not speaking, staring at me, thinking, "Does she let you have your way some of the time?" He asked me. I answer immediately, nearly defensively, "Of course she does." I say, "We do lots of things that I suggest." I tell him. He can tell my feathers are a bit ruffled. Palms up, he says, okay, I'm just checking. She is attractive, and she seems to like you." He goes on, "Look, I'm happy for you. If you're happy with her, great." Not the ringing endorsement I thought he would say, but positive. As we leave the restaurant, we give each other a man hug, and he claps me on the back. "Hey JD," Mike says to me, "I'm glad you're happy. I want to get to know Melanie a little better. One thing," he says, "that's a hell of a schnoz she has." He laughs and tells me, "A-hole." I shout back to him, half laughing. For Mike, I know it wasn't a malicious insult, more of a joke between good friends. But as I said early on, Melanie has a striking look. I find her pronounced nose exotic and attractive, kind of Kardashian-like. She hates it and has said more than once that she wants a nose job. I tell her I like her just the way she is. These comments for me seem to have no assuring effect for Melanie. Several weeks later, Melanie invited me to a company event. Her advertising firm, McClatchy Reed, has an annual dinner with awards and speeches every year in early December. I was excited she had asked me. I chalked this up to another positive sign of our growing relationship. The event was held at the Sheraton Hotel Ballroom in downtown Seattle. I wore a brand new dark suit I had bought for the occasion. It was the first suit I had ever owned. Melanie looked fabulous in a beautiful dress, showing a fair amount of cleavage. I estimated there were a little over 100 people there. In the advertising business, there are several categories of jobs. Production, creative, and client management are some of the key roles. At McClatchy, the client managers can make the most money, almost a commission on revenue generated by the particular client. There were two parts to this position at McClatchy: managing existing clients and getting new clients. Client acquisition. Melanie had told me numerous times she wanted to get out of production and get on the client side. Harrison Locke, who I first met months ago at Infusion, was the executive vice president of client management. Melanie had told me several times that she had made it known to Locke that she was interested in getting on the client side of the business. He had always been gracious and noted her interest, but the subject was never discussed formally. I don't think he thinks I'm attractive enough to be on the client side, she told me as we arrived at the ballroom. Mel, I said, that's ridiculous. You will be the best-looking woman at the entire event. I told her. My words had little to no effect. All the people in client management looked like they could be actors or actresses. She went on. Melanie, honey, I said, you look great now. Let's not worry about it and have a good time. I told her. She ignored my words. I think he thinks my nose is too big, she stated. By this time in our relationship, I had learned that when Melanie gets in this type of mood, my best strategy is to say nothing, nod my head at appropriate times, and try to keep the proper expression on my face. Despite all that, the evening was fun, or most of it was. There were cocktails, a surprisingly good dinner, some speeches, awards, and dancing. There were moments when I had to fight down flares of jealousy. Melanie was quite friendly with a number of good-looking guys at McClatchy, and she was showing a fair amount of Doug in that dress. But she did nothing to quite cross the line. As I said, I'm a pretty good dancer, and I was asked to dance by several of Melanie's female co-workers, and I believe I handled myself quite well. I also think this helped boost me in Melanie's eyes. Towards the end of the evening, Melanie and I ended up talking to Harrison Locke. I know that Melanie wanted to ask him about a client management position again. After a bit of small talk and comments on what a nice evening this had been so far, Melanie brought the subject of her career transitioning to client management with Harrison. Harrison, I just wanted to make sure you knew of my interest in client management. I would love to be on your team and work with our clients, she told him with great enthusiasm. I was watching Harrison as she spoke. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw his gaze shift from Melanie's eyes, just ever so briefly, to her nose. I will certainly note your interest, Melanie. Thank you for letting me know. And with that, Harrison excused himself and moved off into the crowded ballroom. We just stood there for a moment frozen. I'm sure Melanie saw the nose glance, but the last thing I was going to do was bring it up. Let's go, she told me. Leave? Already? I asked. We're going, she firmly stated. She headed for the door, and I had to nearly sprint to catch up with her. The entire way home, I heard how her nose was too big, how it's affecting her career, how all the women in client management were much better looking than she was, and on and on. All my attempts to placate her was quickly and fairly rudely dismissed. I reverted to the same strategy one had used earlier. I quit talking. JD, she asked me, could you loan me enough for some cosmetic surgery? Melanie knew I still had a lump of my tech sale money. She didn't know exactly how much or where I had invested it, but she knew I had it. I've checked, she said, a thread of enthusiasm in her voice. I think for a good doctor, it wouldn't be more than $20,000, probably less. Could you loan that to me? She asked. Once again, I was silent. I thought about it. First off, I wasn't comfortable loaning her the money for this superficial, unnecessary medical procedure. If she needed something to improve her health, I would give her the money in a second. But this was different. I was philosophically against it, but I wasn't stupid either. I kept these thoughts to myself. Sorry, Mel, I said. All my money is tied up in long-term things right now. Remarkably, she didn't argue with me about this, but certainly her mood was in a downward spiral. What had started out as a nice evening had taken a negative turn quite quickly. And the other thing was, for some reason, Melanie was acting as if somehow this was my fault. Life went on and our relationship got better. Slowly, but it was better. The truth of the situation was I was deeply in love with Melanie, and it was I that made many sacrifices to keep the relationship going. I was fine with all this, and apparently it was fine with Melanie too. She had that air about her as if she deserved a pampered life. I was more than eager to pamper her. And then, a couple of things happened. One of her roommates took a job in Southern California and was obviously moving. The other roommate had a serious boyfriend, and they were getting married within the year. I would also say that at a minimum, Melanie stayed at my house at least twice a week. We had talked about her moving in with me, but I always got the impression that she was not ready to make that type of commitment to me. At least not yet. The roommate situation changed things. I kept asking her to move in, now using a more practical reasoning. All her roommates will soon be gone, and she needed a place to live. She never said no. She would just say, I'll think about it. And then one night, while we were discussing the subject again, she agreed to move in. I was overjoyed. I was kissing her, telling her I loved her, talking excitedly about painting walls, and on and on. In the back of my mind, I kind of suspected Melanie looked at this less as a further commitment to our relationship and more as a practical solution to a current problem. I didn't dwell on that thought. I was just so pleased that she would soon be living with me. Once she actually did move, and she quickly took control of things in my house. We painted walls. She chose the colors. We bought new furniture. She picked it out. We remodeled the downstairs bathroom. She designed it. I did the work. The new bathroom soon became her bathroom. Shortly thereafter, we celebrated our 1-year anniversary of being together. We had dinner at the Metropolitan Grill. I had decided that on this occasion, I wanted a little more definition on where our relationship was going. Melanie, I began, I hope you know how much I love and care about you. I know, JD, she said, you tell me all the time. Well, I just wanted to say to you, I said, that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I told her. Wow, JD, she said, that's so sweet. She smiled at me. Mel, I said a little more forcefully, I want to be with you forever. I want to marry you. I told her, staring straight into her eyes. She was speechless, staring back at me. We had talked of long-term commitments and future plans before, but no one had ever mentioned marriage until this point. Are you, she asked hesitantly, proposing to me? Well, no, I began. No, I mean yes. I guess I am proposing to you. I told her. JD, geez. She said, this is a lot to think about. You're going to have to give me some time. She told me. And I did. I didn't demand an answer. I didn't give her any ultimatums. I just every so often reminded her that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. Some weeks later, Isaac and I had a minor bit of success in our business that created a mild buzz in the tech industry. For us, it was huge. We needed the success and the cash flow. Shortly after that, Melanie and I attended a charity event for disadvantaged youth. This was one of these things where there is a dinner, an auction, speeches, and awards were presented. People spent a lot of money pretending to do good for the particular charity. We had a good time, but for the most part, it was uneventful. There is a publication in the Puget Sound area called the Seattle Scene. It's kind of a hip, glossy magazine that showcases the young and glamorous and sells high-end advertising. Apparently, Seattle Scene was at the same charity event Melanie and I were at. A few days after the event, the current issue was published. Melanie excitedly brought it home. JD, you've got to see this. She waved the Seattle Scene magazine in the air. This is so cool, she said. At this point, I don't have any idea what she's talking about, and then she shows me the magazine. There is a photo of Melanie and I at the charity event in the issue of Seattle Scene. We both look pretty good, dressed up, examining an auction item. And then Melanie reads me the caption. Young advertising executive Melanie Miller prepares to bid on an interesting auction item accompanied by date. Successful tech entrepreneur John David Wisniewski. This is so cool, she repeats. And it is kind of cool. Maybe not as cool as Melanie thinks. But then I never liked the spotlight. Without question, she does. The weeks after this event were some of the most positive in our relationship to date. Melanie seems to be more into me than before. I can't discount the effect the Seattle Scene photo had on her attitude. One night, a few weeks after the day she brought home the magazine, I arrived home to Melanie with an iced bottle of champagne. What's going on? I asked, happily surprised by her enthusiasm. Yes, she told me, and then just smiled at me. I was still confused. Yes, what? I asked. Yes, I will marry you, you big dummy. She told me. This was great news and stunning. I was very happy to hear this, but a part of me wanted to ask, what changed? I was also smart enough to not demand an answer to that question at this particular moment. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Melanie's parents live in Missoula, and her mom came out, stayed with us, and they did wedding planning. Most of the decision-making was done by Melanie, and that was fine with me. Occasionally, I was asked obligatorily my opinion on something, but it never really mattered. There were some practical matters we needed to get settled. First off, the state of Washington does not require a blood test before marriage, but we both got physicals with a blood screen. We met with my insurance agent, and each got a term life insurance policy for $500,000 with each other as beneficiary. And then we met with a family practice lawyer. We discussed our estates, mine consisting of mostly my house and business. Melanie's was a little more complex. Her largest asset was her parents' vacation home on Flathead Lake that she and her sister would one day inherit. The scenario he asked us to consider was this. If we were to have children, and then if Melanie were to die before her parents, would her children have any rights to the cabin on Flathead Lake? What we finally agreed to do was to commingle our assets. Though it was still only my name on the deed to my house, Melanie would have rights to the house, just as I would have rights to the Flathead cabin after her parents passed away. It was sort of complex, but it made sense. At this point, I was prepared to agree to and sign most anything. My desire for Melanie was so strong. The wedding finally happened, and it was a fun and expensive event. My cousin Mike was my best man and Isaac was a groomsman. We honeymooned at the Flathead Lake cabin. I had not been to the area before, but it was where Melanie and her family grew up vacationing. It was beautiful and modern looking while still maintaining a rustic presence. You couldn't quite call it a lodge, but in my mind, it was certainly more than a cabin. And it was right on the lake. It was a magical place, and it was worth a lot of money. The Californians had discovered this quadrant of Montana decades ago. Then came the wealthy Washingtonians, followed by the Oregonians. Thankfully, Melanie's family had owned the home for a number of years before the migrations. I was fairly sure they couldn't afford to buy it now, few could, but its value, for some reason, made me feel better about the legal documents we signed before we were married. After the honeymoon, it was back to work for both of us. Our post-wedding lifestyle didn't change too much. Melanie was already living at my house, and as I had mentioned, she was running the house these days. I was happy. There was one thing that did bother me. She didn't take my last name. She didn't even hyphenate her last name. She just kept her family name. I just like my name, she told me. It sounds good in an alliterative way, she said. But this was a small thing, I told myself. There were sacrifices in all relationships, weren't there? I focused on the positive things. Finally, after all these post-pubescent desires, I had the type of woman I had always desired. My business with Isaac certainly had its ups and downs, but we were making some money. So far, no large tech company had seemed interested in acquiring us. Work for Melanie had its ups and downs too. She was frustrated with her role and still wanted to get into client management. She was convinced if she got a nose job, this would change things for her at McClatchy. I continued to tell her I liked her just the way she was. This appeared to have little comforting effect. Over the months, things began to change slowly, but nonetheless they were changing. Melanie, though normally moody, seemed to rarely be in a good mood. She was working longer hours and seemed more and more stressed by her job. She didn't seem to like it, and our sex life suffered. Before and around the wedding, we would make love a couple of times per week. It was daily on the honeymoon, certainly every weekend for sure. That tapered off to maybe once a week and sometimes once every 2 weeks. One Saturday, I carefully brought up the subject of our sex life. Mel, I said, I know you've got a lot going on at work, but I miss spending time with you. I told her. What do you mean? She replied, we're together constantly. She added, you know, I said, like in the bedroom. On my God, she exclaimed. We have sex all the time. She told me. Mel, it's been over a week. I told her. She sat for a moment, thinking, but didn't reply. We made love that night, and perhaps it was my imagination, but it didn't feel like she was into it as much as normal. My business with Isaac was also experiencing a dry spell. After our last success, we had yet to come up with anything lately. Both Isaac and I were working long hours, and the money was barely trickling in. Though Isaac and I never argued, the state of our business was creating tension in our business and personal relationship. A few months later, a rainy Wednesday, Isaac approached me. JD, I need to talk with you, he said, eyes cast downward. This was odd. We were always so informal here at the office. Something definitely was up. Sure, I said. What's going on? He hesitated. Man, JD, we've had some good times together, and we've created some great products over the years. But, he said, I'm not making any money. He told me. For a moment I absorbed what Isaac had said. Isaac, we've just hit a temporary lull. I told him. Once we get rolling again, it will get better. I can fund the business with my reserves. I added. JD, Isaac said, I've received an offer from Microtech. I'd be a manager. The money's really good and I want to buy a house. Right now, I can barely qualify for a loan, he told me. I tried to talk him out of it, but it was hard to argue with his logic. At first I was a little upset with him, but I could tell he really felt bad. He even offered to come in on weekends to help me. I knew that would never work, but it was a nice gesture anyway. Isaac was scheduled to start at Microtech in a little over a week. I decided to try to run the business on my own and see what happened. Despite my acceptance of Isaac's departure, this change in my business upset me. I tried to talk to Melanie about it, but her response was to suck it up and keep going. Not the understanding, sympathetic comments I was hoping to hear. Over the next year, things at both my business and Melanie's job were stressful and rarely positive. Melanie was constantly under pressure. The advertising industry is a risky game. Lose one big client, and it can have an immediate effect on cash flow and layoffs. Once the rumors began about a particular client, they grew a life of their own. All this added to Melanie's stress. My business also had changed. Whereas before Isaac and I discussed certain ideas and bounced concepts off one another, I was alone now. Where I used to be excited about walking the busy streets to my office and working, now I entered the building with feelings close to dread. I had considered hiring someone, but I would have to fund them from my reserves. Programmers were getting paid a lot of money these days, and I wasn't sure I could even find someone to hire. My thoughts began to change directions. My lease was for another 5 months. I had a lot to think about in these coming months. The combination of both our individual work stress took its toll on our relationship. Melanie was often in a bad mood. Where she was angry, I just kind of moped around, feeling sorry for myself and needing her. I would try to talk to her about my work problems, her job problems, or our relationship. These conversations were rarely productive for us. None of this was good for our sex life. I needed her more than ever, and she didn't act like she needed or wanted me much at all. Meanwhile, I continued to talk with Isaac. He listened and understood the stress of my business. I could, to some degree, continue to bounce ideas off Isaac, but he was busy and didn't have the time like when we were partners. I also had my cousin Mike to talk to. Once every couple of weeks we would get together for a beer and to talk. This was another one of the few bright spots in my life at this time. I would talk about Mel and my relationship. He would listen, nod his head, but I knew deep down he had never been a huge fan of Melanie. One of the things I did when I wasn't at work was work around my house. It was an older house and there was always something to do. I had kind of a mental checklist of projects to complete. I prioritized them by need, cost, and time. These activities were therapeutic for me. One day I was down at the local lumber store and in the showroom was a beautiful set of French doors. The sign on the doors said, regularly $3,000 on sale $1,000. Huh, I thought. I grabbed a measuring tape and measured the doors. I then went home, removed the cheap trim on the old aluminum sliding door and measured the rough opening. I think the doors at the lumber store would fit. I went back to the lumber store. I'll give you $700 for these doors, I told the guy at the counter. I need $800. He told me. $750 and you deliver. Final offer. I told him, and he agreed. I knew exactly what had happened. Someone had ordered the doors and measured wrong. The customer likely refused to pay, and the lumber store was stuck with the doors. I had examined the doors. They were a beautiful fiberglass pair. They also had what is called a multi-point lock. This provided better security and helped with energy loss. The only negative would be that we'd need a separate entrance key for this lock than all the other doors in the house. I was excited about my new project, and for a short time my positive energy buoyed Melanie's spirits too. One Monday morning at my office, and I got a call from Isaac. I was down to less than 2 months on my lease, and I was unsure about renewing it. JD, I wanted to run something by you, Isaac said. We need a programmer. It would be a contract job. You could still work on your own projects, but it would be full-time. He told me. And then he told me the daily rate. This was a great opportunity. I told him I'd think about it. I get it, JD, Isaac said, but I need to get someone by the end of the week. You're the first person I called. He added, I'll let you know by tomorrow. I told him, and he agreed. My first instinct was to call Mike and discuss the offer from Isaac. We agreed to meet that night. I hadn't even thought to talk to Melanie about the opportunity. After getting Mike's feedback, the following day I called Isaac and accepted. There was a bit of negotiation, but nothing serious. I informed the real estate company that I would not be renewing the lease. Suddenly, an enormous weight felt like it was lifted off my back. That night at home, I told Melanie about this change I was planning on making. "You mean you're giving up your business?" she asked, not quite sharing the positivity that I had. I told her not really. I would still be able to work on it while I wasn't on the clock for microtech. "But you aren't keeping the office?" she asked. I told her, "No, it would be a needless expense." "So will you commute to Bellevue every day?" she asked. "No, I'll set up a home office in the downstairs bedroom." I told her. "You're going to put an office in my house?" she asked. Her house? At that point, any type of reasonable discussion evaporated. Melanie was showing no sympathy or understanding of my situation. She was so self-absorbed, all she thought about was how it would affect her. For once, I stood up for myself. I told her it was my house. I bought it long before I met her. I told her I was making this sacrifice for our long-term future and the future of any children we may have. And on and on. This led to one of these marital cold wars that can last a day or two. During this time, I plugged in my headphones and worked on my door project, which was actually turning out quite well. Next step was to replace the old decaying cedar deck the doors opened up to. Finally, I apologized, and she didn't quite accept, but things got a little better. I moved out of my office downtown and set up office in the downstairs bedroom. I began working for Isaac. It was like old times, but better. I was making money, and I didn't have the financial pressure of running an office. I knew what I was doing and was producing for microtech, and my commute was a flight of stairs. There were times when I tried to talk to Melanie about our relationship. I loved her and I wanted things like they had once been. She would agree and things were temporarily better, but nothing really changed. And just a few small comments she made me think she thought less of me for what she thought was giving up on my business. This stung a little bit, but I wasn't looking for another full-blown argument. And now we are back to the point in time when I had met with my cousin Mike at the Norseman and heard about the drug dealer in our neighborhood. I knew when Mel was in one of these moods it was best to just leave her alone. I kept telling myself that the stress from her work was creating the negativity towards me. She needed a place to vent, I told myself. And there were times when I almost believed that too. I decided to do a little work. I knew there was no magical wand I could wave to get her out of her bitchy mood. Tomorrow was Friday. If I could get a little work done tonight, maybe I could start tearing out the old wood deck. The French doors I had installed looked great. That made the old deck, by comparison, look even worse. I did a fair amount of work that night, and by noon on Friday, I was all caught up with a head start on next week. I decided to start the hard work of tearing out the old deck. The installation of the new deck is kind of fun, but the unpleasant part is getting the old one out. Unfortunately, they had nailed the old cedar to the pressure-treated lumber frame. Removing screws is much easier and far more painless. I began. After several hours of nail removal and what appeared to me as not much progress, I grabbed my hydro flask and sat in the back of my yard near the neighbor's fence. I drank the water and tried to envision my plan for the deck. And then I noticed one of my crawl space vents was open. Oh God, I thought. This had happened a few years ago, and I had ended up with a family of raccoons living under my house. For $100 to the exterminator later, they were gone. He told me the first thing to look for is any access into the crawl space, normally an open vent. If I thought removing nails was a crappy job, crawling underneath the house and looking for rodents was far worse. I went into the house, got my old ski goggles, a stocking hat, and a flashlight. I also carried a small shovel, for defense I thought. Crawling through bugs, spiders, and potential rodents was real close to the bottom of activities I would choose to do. But I had to. I didn't want to pay an exterminator a few $100s to find out the wind blew open my vent cover. I took a deep breath and crawled through the small opening on my foundation vent. It was cramped and filthy. I turned on the flashlight and searched for rodents. So far, nothing. Then I saw something, some type of lump directly in front of me about halfway under the house. I cautiously crawled toward it, but nothing was moving. It didn't look like a rodent nest. As I got closer, it looked like a piece of lumber on top of something else. I probed the lump cautiously with the small shovel. No movement. With the shovel, I pushed away the lumber and saw what I thought was a ball of clothes. No, it was a bag, or actually an old backpack, full of something. Meanwhile, Damon sat in his cell. He felt a quiet anger, an anger at himself. He had been so close to his goal, $250,000, and he could have bought his uncle's body shop in West Hattiesburg, building included. A new life for him. The free lawyer that talked to him told him he would likely do 14 to 20 months. He could be out in 11 months if he behaved himself, the guy had said. Like this was some type of good news. I slowly shuffled backwards out of the crawl space, pulling the mysterious backpack along. I knew the pack had not been under the house less than 2 years ago when I had the raccoon problem. I never saw this pack there then. Strange. I brushed the dirt and debris off myself and did a quick inspection to make sure no spiders were on my clothes. I then sat on the old deck with the backpack crammed with who knew what next to me. I removed my gloves and unzipped the tattered red pack. There was money in it. A lot of money. Worn bills, mostly hundreds and some 20s. Most of it was in banded stacks, and there was a small amount loose. My heart started beating hard. What was this? Where had it come from, I wondered. Then I got nervous. I glanced around. Had any of the neighbors seen me? Outside, with stacks of money? I quickly gathered it all up and brought it inside. I closed the shades and laid the pack out on the kitchen table. I dumped all the money out and inspected the pack. I found nothing identifying the owner or any other telling information on the pack. I then counted the money. There were stacks of hundreds held together with rubber bands. After inspecting, I determined these stacks held $100 bills, $10,000 per stack. I laid out the stacks and counted them, 22 stacks. I then counted the loose currency. The grand total, $230,820. Oh my God. I was nervous and excited too. I had never seen near this much cash in person before. I got to thinking, I need to call Mike. What is my legal responsibility, I wondered. I was 8 digits into calling him when I hung up. What if he told me I had to give it up? I kept thinking, and then I thought of the drug dealer Mike spoke about the other night. Could somehow he have hidden the money under my house? That didn't seem likely or logical, but what other explanation was there? I knew I should tell Mike, but there is a greedy side to me. Now, I had the money. It was mine. The moment I handed it over, I knew I'd never see it again. I was contemplating all this when surprisingly Melanie showed up. She's home early on a Friday afternoon. Silently, I hear her shuffling around, coming through the door. No call of greeting to me. She walked into the kitchen, saw all this money, and stops. "What is all this?" she asked. "Where did it come from?" When I look at her, and there was an excited look in her eyes. It is a look I had not seen from her in quite some time. "Mel, you're not going to believe this," I said. I look at her. She still has that excited gaze in her eyes, staring at the pile of money. Then she looks at me, as if to say, "Go on." So I was out in the backyard working on the deck. I tell her and she nods, and I noticed one of the foundation vents open. I go on. I doubt she even knew we had foundation vents. I then told her about finding the backpack and discovering the money. I hadn't told her previously about the drug house around the corner. And for some reason, I didn't tell her now either. There's $230,000 here. I tell Melanie. "Oh my God." She gushes. "This is fantastic. What are we going to buy? What are we going to do?" She's saying, staring at the money. "Melanie, first off," I say, "before we do anything, we are going to need to think about all this. Let's wait a while, just to make sure we're safe." I say, "Safe?" She questions, "Safe from what? And wait how long?" She further asks. I tell her we need to wait a year or so before we do anything with this money. She's nodding her head, but I am unclear how much of what I'm saying she's absorbing. She just keeps staring at the money. In the meantime, I take the money and the pack into my office. I have an old heavy gray metal file cabinet. The top drawer is lockable. I put the entire contents in that near empty top drawer and lock it. Melanie's got some energy all of a sudden. She's excited and more affectionate than she has been in months. She talks about trips we could take and cars we could buy. I'm glad she's happy, but I try to temper all that spending enthusiasm. I tell her we need to wait before we start dipping into the money. Once some time goes by, we can plan on what we may do with the money. Even though I'm being the voice of reason, I'm excited too. I remember one Christmas when I was little. There was this one big gift wrapped up in gold paper with a red ribbon. It was for me. My parents made me wait and open it last. I didn't even recall the gift that Christmas, but I did remember the thrill of waiting, anticipating opening the big present. I felt a little like that, thinking about the money, knowing we could not spend it yet, but anticipating what we may be able to do with it at some point if we're able to keep it. And to be honest, I was already mentally spending some of the money. My thoughts were more centered around how I could fix up the house, what remodeling projects we could do to improve the house. Nonetheless, Mel was happy for the moment. That night we made love, for the first time in what seemed like a long time. The found money had energized her. The good mood stretched into Saturday. I was getting affectionate smiles, friendly touches, and a positive attitude from Mel. I had not seen this type of behavior from her since before I had shut down my office. "So, honey," Melanie asked later that Saturday, "isn't half the money legally mine?" "Melanie," I said with a hint of exasperation in my voice, "the money is both of ours, but we agreed to wait on doing anything with the money." "Okay," I added. She didn't really answer me. She just walked up and gave me a big kiss. That made me happy. So happy I didn't really notice that she hadn't quite agreed with what I had said. In the coming days and weeks, the positivity of our relationship continued. Our love life improved too. I even got a rare post-wedding bee job. Things were much more like the early days of our relationship. I told myself that perhaps the idea of this financial windfall had taken the pressure off Mel at work, and that was allowing her to be more relaxed and positive about her life and our relationship. A few weeks later, I received a phone call from Isaac.